Hello, welcome to the 87th episode of the series Decolonizing the Mind. And I'll follow up on the sub-series on philosophy. And this time I'll talk about innate knowledge. But before I go there, let me talk about the political things happening. Yesterday there were elections in Venezuela and in my country, Suriname. Um, the elections in Venezuela went very well for the governing party. They have control over the parliament and the states, governors, um, and the thing is that there's even an increase in the participation of the electorate because of the boycott of the US and the opposition. There was a decrease in participation, but compared to the last elections, for the parliamentary elections, they went up with 10%, and that's good. In Suriname, it's the reverse. The participation was above 70% last election. It went down to about 50 some plus now. The election has been won by the progressive forces, but with a slim number, so they have to make a coalition. We'll see how that goes. So let me go back to philosophy. And I'm dealing with this question of the sources of knowledge. I'll come back to the canon of Western epistemology that takes only two sources, observation and reasoning, and leaves out all the other sources. And last time I discussed common sense, and today I will discuss innate knowledge. And I showed with how DTM uses common sense. We acknowledge the weak side of it, sensus candivissus, but we acknowledge also the strong side. We can mistake a rope for a snake, but we will not mistake a rope for an elephant. And then we apply common sense not as a general universal rule, but use the strength on a case-by-case basis. And I give examples on mathematics. You could look at the last videos. And we use common sense as a method of critique to deconstruct expert stupidity and destroy the authority of Eurocentric knowledge. You can go into that video of last week. Now let's look at innate knowledge. What is innate knowledge? Innate knowledge are concepts that are present in the mind from birth, independent of sensory experience or observation and reasoning. Now, in the European tradition, Plato, Greek philosophers came already up with this idea that human possesses innate knowledge of abstract forms, justice, beauty, through recollection of pre-existing soul experiences. So the soul exists independent of the body, and ideas, he argues, that the physical world is a shadow of a higher eternal world of abstract perfect forms, justice, beauty, equality, and the soul, the psyche, existed before birth and has direct knowledge of these forms. And at birth, this knowledge is forgotten but can be recollected through reasoning and an inquiry. And a famous example of Plato is the cave. He says, and the slave boy who had no formal education, but through the Socratic means of questioning, he discovered geometric truth, doubling the area of a square. So learning is not acquiring new information, but learning is recollecting what the soul already knew. And Plato developed this in one of his works, Phaedo. He claims that the soul is immortal and cyclical, reincarnating across lifetimes. So before birth, it contemplated the forms which explain why human grasps abstract truth, mathematical principles without sensory input. And then the allegory of the cave in his work on the Republic, where the cave symbolizes ignorance and escaping into sunlight represent recollections of this basic truth, true knowledge of forms, which is innate and obscured by bodily senses and material distractions. Now, so Plato's sense of innate knowledge is based on the concept of a soul existing beyond the body. And then you have Descartes, one of the founders of modern European philosophy, says that some ideas like mathematical truth and an idea like God, these are innate ideals. I'll talk about Descartes in one of the coming videos in more detail based on his famous I think therefore I can. I'll analyze it and why it is nonsense that he's talking. So Descartes, who doubted all sensory knowledge to find indubitable truth, he concluded that even the senses can deceive and the mind has innate structure, logic, mathematics, which can be doubted. He gives the argument of the wax. He said a piece of wax changes property when melted, yet the mind still recognizes it as wax. And Descartes argues that this understanding comes from innate reasoning, not from senses. And also, Descartes sees God as a guarantor of truth, and that innate knowledge just basically comes from God, ensuring the reliability of human vision and the external world. Then you have the Chinese philosophy has a concept of innate knowledge, but they focus on ethics. So through debates about the human nature, moral intuition, the relation between self-cultivation and cosmic principles, and where Plato and Descartes try to put in rationalism to argue that there is innate knowledge. The Chinese focus on moral inclinations, intuitive capacities or cosmic alignment, and emphasize practical ethics and self-realization. So Confucianism grapples with whether humans are born with innate moral tendencies and require education to become virtuous. A neo-Confucianist, Mencius, talk about the four sprouts. The shoots of a plant is a sprout. Human nature is inherently good, and people possess this basic element of virtue, which is compassion, shame, respect, moral discernment. So ethics is part of knowledge, and the Chinese then argues that some of the ethics is innate. And then you have the Indian concept of innate knowledge, where Western rationalism focus on truth, for example, mathematical ideas, or Chinese philosophies focus on moral intuition. Indian tradition centered on self-knowledge, karmic imprints, and the innate potential for liberation. So the Vedanta philosophy says that the ultimate truth, the identity of the individual self with universal consciousness, is innate but obscured by ignorance. And then the self-realization and liberation from the cyclical extinction of reincarnation is done through, contemplation and yoga and all these things. And then you have the African concept of innate knowledge that relates innate knowledge to community and ancestors and the cosmos rather than individual knowledge. And innate knowledge intersects ideas of ancestral wisdom, communal memory, and inherent moral intuition, and framed through oral traditions, prophets, and cosmological systems. The concept of Ubuntu implies that ethical understanding is not learned but arises from an innate connection to others. Sayings like it takes a village to raise a child reflect the belief that wisdom is passed down through generation but also resides inherently in communal bond. So knowledge is not owned but shared, and innate understanding emerges from collective existence. The Fanti philosophy in Africa believes that certain individuals are born with certain knowledge and abilities that are not acquired from experience, although they can be developed through experience. One African philosopher, which I deal with in the book, Madhuabuchi Dukor makes a link between innate knowledge and intuition. And he says perception is defined as the apprehension of the world through the sense or the general exercise of it or particular cases of it exercising and also what is perceived. On the other hand, intuition is a direct apprehension of truth, which is not the direct result of reasoning or sense perception. So intuition gives you some kind of knowledge, but then it is innate. Now, how do we look from DTM at innate knowledge? So, uh, the reason I look at Western philosophies and Chinese, Indian, African philosophies is that DTM tries to learn from all these traditions, including the European one, by the way. And Europe, they have discarded innate knowledge, it's not in the canon of science, but the way European philosophy dealing with innate knowledge, which I mentioned. And so, as ethics is part of knowledge, there are certain, in the DTM philosophy, I argue that there are certain ethical concepts that people are born with and are expressed in intuition, the African concept, and awareness, and community related and not necessarily individual related. And I'll give you the concept of freedom. Now, in Western sociology, Harvard professor Orlando Patterson from Jamaica, he says he wrote a book to show that the concept of freedom was exclusively discovered in the West. He says one of the major objectives of his work is to show that freedom was a peculiarly Western value and ideal. And he argues that in Africa, the Africans didn't mind being enslaved. He says in pre-colonial African society, slavery was widespread and the release from slavery was not uncommon. The antithesis of slavery was never freedom in the Western sense, by which they mean personal individual freedom. What the ambitious slave sought and what the self-interested masters offered was a reduction of the slave's marginality and his partial resocialization in the master's community. This is nonsense, talk with fancy words, saying that the slave doesn't mind being enslaved. Ironically enough, his argument is not based on scientific data. He doesn't have a representative collection of interviews of enslaved Africans who reflected on slavery. He presents none of these things. He just gives a list of, this philosopher talked about freedom, that philosopher talked about freedom, and then they didn't find African philosophers about it. So he just made it up about what the African enslaved people thought. A similar, basic, more explicit racist things is proposition is in the work of the Dutch historian Peter Emmer, who says, who abolished the slave trade and slavery? For a long time, the answer seemed simple, the governments in Europe and the US, Cuba, and Brazil. But he says the abolition of slavery was a typical feature of Western civilization. But he doesn't say the introduction of slavery was a typical feature of Western civilization. That is how the mind is being colonized, by telling lies. By telling lies by professors who have authority in the history of slavery in the North. He says there are no indications that either the insurgent slaves or the Maroons have had the intention to abolish slavery and to strive toward general slave emancipation. He referred to the uprising under the leadership of Tula in the Dutch island of Curaçao, in the Caribbean island of the Dutch colony in Curaçao, who referred to the liberation of the French slave and to the fact that he said that the Dutch should also liberate its slave because it was occupied by the French. So he says there's no doubt that the Curaçao slave uprising of 1795 had its roots in abolitionism in Europe and was not based on a separate abolitionist ideology originating in the Caribbean. This kind of nonsense made me sick, white people just saying black people like slavery. What kind of nonsense is this? But look now in the experience of the concept of freedom. And a great example is the story in the autobiography by Frederick Douglass, who was is a big figure in the history an icon in history against enslavement in the US. And he uses the concept of mental slavery. And he gives the example, the description of a physical confrontation that he had with his enslaver, Mr. Kofi. Kofi wanted to beat Douglas as a form of punishment, and then Douglas says, Mr. Kofi entered the stable with a long rope, and just as I was half out of the loft, he caught a hold of my legs and was about tying me. As soon as I found what he was up to, I gave a sudden spring, and as I did so, he holding to my leg, I was brought sprawling on the stable floor. Mr. Coffey seemed now to think he had me and could do what he pleased, but at this moment, from whence came the spirit, I don't know. I resolved to fight, and suiting my action to the resolution, I seized Miss Coffey hard by the throat. Now, he says now, in the confrontation, he was successful in beating up his enslaver. And he says, the battle with Mr. Kofi was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom. He's talking about now innate freedom, and revived me with a sense of my own manhood, which is just innate. He recalled that the departed self-confidence it recalled the departed self-confidence and inspired me again with a determination to be free. The gratification afforded by the triumph was a full compensation for whatever else might follow, even that itself. He only can understand the deep satisfaction which I experienced who has himself repelled by force the bloody arm of enslavement. I felt as I never felt before. It was a glorious resurrection from the tomb of enslavement to the heaven of freedom. My long-crushed spirit arose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place. And I now resolved that however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I didn't hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping me must also succeed in killing me. So there are four things about the story of Douglas. First is he acknowledged that mental slavery is the submission of the mind, a spirit that has been crushed, a form of weakness, a lack of self-confidence. It's about the mechanisms that have led to this state of mind. And that liberation from mental slavery comes through self-realization, the awakening of consciousness. And this requires innate knowledge. And he recounts that his self-confidence rose through during a fight that made him realize that mental freedom will come from fighting. It's not the result of study or that someone else told you to do. It's the outcome of a process that takes place in the mind. So knowledge about freedom is not through the study as Patterson and Emmer think that you study the French Revolution and you get an idea of freedom. It's nonsense. It is innate. The process of change in the mind is the result of confrontation, and that's starts the process of awakening the spirit of liberation. And then violence can become a tool of liberation from mental slavery. It brings about a new knowledge about the hidden courage and strength of the enslaved and the weakness of the enslaver. So here you see innate knowledge tells you a lot of things about freedom, about how to fight, about the mechanisms of the colonizing of the mind. And Frantz Fanon, in his work, came up with a similar analysis in his discussion on the role of violence in the liberation struggle in Algeria. He said the violence which has ruled over the ordering of the colonial world, which has ceaselessly drummed the rhythm for the destruction of the native social forms and broken up without reserve the system of reference of the economy, the customs of dress and external life, that same violence will be claimed and taken over by the native at the moment when, deciding to embody history in his own person, he searches into the forbidden quarters. And on an individual level, violence changes the colonized persons. He says, at the level of the individual, violence is a cleansing force. It frees the natives from his inferiority complex and from his despair and inaction. It makes him fearless and restore his self-respect. Now, in the canon of the European science, innate knowledge has been removed from knowledge production. And if you do that, you don't understand oppression, how it works. and how the resistance of oppression works when the wakening up of the spirit discovers this innate concept of freedom. That's for so far. Next time I'll continue with these philosophical lectures on decolonizing the mind. See you next week.